Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. CMC connects people and ideas through community conversations at forums just like this one nearly every week. I'm Lisa Hinson. I'm the president of Hinson Limited Public Relations. I'm also proud to serve as a member of CMC's Board of Trustees. For those of you who are out there joining us by live stream, we're coming to you from our home in Columbus's historic Italian Village at the Ellis. So thank you to the Ellis for having us today. If you scan the QR codes at your tables, you can learn more about today's forum, take a short survey, and see the many organizations that support your not-for-profit Columbus Metropolitan Club. I want to say a special thank you to Crane Group for sponsoring today's forum. Things like these conversations, they don't happen without Crane Group and others coming forward to invest in them, so we thank you for that. We're also grateful to the presenting sponsor of our live stream, and that's the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation, and our live stream partner, the Columbus Dispatch. And thank you to the Ellis again for hosting us. Can we have a round of applause for everybody who's made this possible today? Okay. The proposed major overhaul of Columbus's 70-year-old zoning code will bring big changes to Columbus. With today's panel, we unpack the way this summer's proposed zoning overhaul could reshape our city. I'd like to welcome today's distinguished panelists, the Honorable Rob Dorrance, who's President Pro Tem of Columbus City Council. Thanks, Rob. Leah Evans, who is President and CEO of Homeport. Glad to have you here, Leah. Kathy Green, who's Vice Chair and Zoning Committee Chair for the Columbus Southside Area Commission. Thanks, Kathy. And Dr. Rebecca Kemper, CEO of Columbus Landmarks. Thank you for being here. And the all-important moderator role. Returning once again to CMC is Mark Ferenchek, the news director with WSU Public Media. All right, Mark, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this right now, considering what's going on in the city. Usually zoning is an issue that people don't talk about too often unless it affects you directly down the street. If there's a grocery store that's planned for your area or apartments, gas station, then people get involved. But now the city's embarking on something that will really change the look and the feel of the city and the direction of the city with the zone-in effort. So I just wanted to start out with asking Rob, for people who may not be as familiar with it, if you can just give us a little brief explanation about what zone-in is and why now? Why is the city doing this now?
Well, thanks, Mark, and certainly thanks to the CMC and everyone for being here today to join for this important conversation. I think the question of why now, it's a question of growth, right? It would not surprise, I think, most folks in this room to hear all the stats that we've known over the last 10 years, the amount that our city and region has grown, and the amount of growth that's projected for our region for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And when you look at what does that growth mean for our community, what does that growth mean for our land use policies, and when you think about our base code going back to 70 years, so we've not had a comprehensive rewrite in over 70 years, we don't do a lot of things the same way that we did them 70 years ago, right? And we probably shouldn't from time to time, given what was going on 70 years ago as it relates to land use policies in our community. So how do we plan for that growth? How do we accommodate that growth? If anyone here has rented an apartment or bought a house in the last couple of years, you've seen what our housing crisis has done to rents and housing prices for folks. We have a supply and demand crisis in Columbus. We have incredible demand for housing, and we don't have enough supply. So the question is, how do we change our land use policies to create more supply? And I think some folks in this room may be surprised to hear in that conversation around growth, last year, we built fewer housing units in Columbus than we did the year before, while also at the same time needing 100,000 new housing units over the next 10 years just to keep pace with that growth. So that's the problem that we're staring at in our community right now. And what Zone In looks to do is to identify key areas of our city. So we're talking about the first phase of Zone In is about 4%, about a little over 12,300 parcels in Columbus, and update that zoning. To get beyond what we thought those parcels made sense to have built on them 70 years ago, and think about what should be built on them today and over the next 20 and 30 years, to allow commercial and residential to exist together, to allow more thoughtfulness when it comes to public infrastructure investments that are necessary to support these kinds of things. So at the end of the day, what is it? It's basically us looking at a portion of the city that we think is going to be vital towards accommodating that growth and updating our land use plan to plan for that growth. If nothing else, I would like to tell folks around Zone In is rather than being very reactive, as we have been in our community for decades as it relates to development and housing policies, this is our attempt to be proactive and actually put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we would like to see our community grow within these particular areas of Columbus.
So there have been a number of public meetings on this, but council is supposed to vote on this, I believe, by the end of the month, on July 29th. Is that correct?
I am hopeful, fingers crossed, to have legislation for my colleagues to consider likely at our final council meeting before our August break.
Okay. So two of the things that this is going to be addressing is height and also parking. And I know that's been a concern that's been raised along some of the major corridors. It could be up to 16 stories, like along Broad Street, I think. Other areas would allow some height that's a little bit shorter. But if I throw this open to anybody, talk about concerns about parking not being required in some cases, and also about the height requirements and the affordable housing component of that.
Okay, then I'll jump in. Good afternoon. It's good to be with you all. I'm very excited because for my planner friends in the room, we're having our moment. People are talking about planning and zoning, so let's get excited about that. I've been in this role, in these kind of roles for about 20 some odd years, and never have we had such excitement around zoning. So I think that speaks well to why this is our moment as a community to address some of these things, Mark. So I'll get back on topic about parking. And height, but had to give that shout out. I want to really just emphasize that, yes, I'm in the housing space, but what's been tremendously encouraging and exciting about these conversations is it's about all the things that make a community work. It's been about sidewalks and bike lanes and green spaces and housing and business opportunities. It's been about all these intersections that really are what land use is about. That's what we're doing. We're trying to have a plan that accommodates all the different land use types that we're embraced as a community, but puts them in spaces and places that make sense. And so we get to the parking piece. I think what's always important, I am a developer, so I'll put that hat back on, is there's a cost factor to building parking when parking isn't necessarily mandated by the users. So I have a development that's a 1-to-1 parking ratio, and right now I need a variance to do that, when typically with my properties and the communities that we are serving, we maybe see a 1-to-1, usually a little bit less in terms of parking utilization because of the population we're serving. Generally don't have 1-to-1 cars in the household. So really it's about right sizing what the code says is required. I know that causes a lot of heartache and pain because it's the idea is like, they're going to overrun, people are going to overrun the streets. We're not going to be able to accommodate the parking when it's needed. But I think what we're hearing from the market and what the market is telling us is that people want alternative modes of transportation. So I do think it's important that we think about the zoning piece in conjunction with the other things that are going on in the community that are really trying to solve and really address our overall transportation needs, our overall parking needs. One of the projects that we're working on right now, we're looking at shared parking. Is that an option or an opportunity where we're not all overbuilding parking? We all drive by the Home Depot, the Meijer, at Easton, and see seas of parking. What if if we reduce that? What if we saw more housing or more businesses or more other use, more schools and other green spaces instead of more parking? And I think that's one of the things that has been really exciting, to even have that conversation and not be so locked in on this many spaces per this many units.
If I could add a couple things. One of the things on the south side that has come up is that people do prefer the density to be on the corridors. So again, this phase is the commercial corridors, which for us is going to be Parsons, Lockbourne, and South High Street. And I want to call out my Nationwide Children's Hospital friends that a lot of people that do move onto the south side now perhaps have an affiliation with Nationwide Children. So that ability to be close to where you work and not to have that long commute, which again exacerbates the transportation requirements. You can walk to work, maybe you don't need as many cars, is important. From the concerns perspective, from the residents is, one of the things that they do prefer is the step back, which is in the code, right? So it may be a tall building or maybe even like 5 to 7 stories for us. But you do have to step it back before you get to the residents. And so people don't necessarily want that big wall right next to them.
No, and I think from the preservation community too, we're not really car people. We like to bike, we like to walk, and we like to share a car if we do need to use one, and use mass transit. So those are all things where we are really supportive of moving away from a car-centric perspective. And it really makes the city much more accessible and affordable for all. And that's something we really like within the proposals. But again, we're kind of in a similar spot. What we're hearing is a real concern about what happens when we allow corridors to build up to such a height that it could actually be kind of walling off communities that did have access to those corridors that might feel even more alienated. I think that's something we're just really mindful of where that might be happening. And when we're proposing additional stories for affordable housing, I think we have questions about how do we make sure that those commitments from those developers are for the long term, right? We want to see a little bit more information on that too, because that's a permanent change to the character and feel of a corridor. And we want to make sure if those investments are coming in, we have that long-term support. So I think it's building in. Other cities do that, like New York City, other things. When you make that commitment, it's a long-term lifetime commitment, either to that resident or to spaces. But those would be some of the concerns we're hearing too.
Yeah, I would add, one, our code currently prioritizes parking over people, right? So when we're talking about the need for more housing in our community, when we have a parking requirement that's 1.5 spaces per unit, no matter what, no matter where, no matter when, that's a pretty blunt instrument that gets deployed that, again, requires folks like Leah to build way more parking than she needs, which increase costs. Again, that land could have been used for more housing units, or it's cost for her that actually is not an amenity that folks may or may not need there. So shifting from a conversation around a government mandate to allow folks to have a better idea of what parking is really going to require for that site, I think makes more sense. Also, keep in mind, the number one variance that we grant at Columbus City Council is a parking variance. Nearly every project that comes to us has a reduction in parking required. So we're already basically responding right now to the marketplace as they're requesting these parking reductions. But when you need to come and get a variance from me, you're adding 3, 4, 6, 12 months to a process that is probably at best Byzantine to sort of navigate. And that also ensures that folks that may want to access, may want to build something, that really keeps them out, because accessing that kind of bureaucratic red tape really forces folks to consider, well, do I really want to jump into this to begin with? And I think that really provides a bit of a chilling effect for other folks getting into the housing production space.
I was going to ask about actually neighborhood character, but you talked about, again, just the time it takes a lot of times for developers to build. And I covered, for example, the Giant Eagle project in Schumacher Place near German Village, and that took a number of years. Having said that, some people are concerned that this will give developers too much sway in terms of what the city's going to become, and not enough neighborhood impact or neighborhood discussion as to what should go into neighborhoods. So how do you address those types of concerns that neighborhoods and citizens aren't going to have enough of a say as to what develops?
Well, I'm going to give my answer, then I'm going to throw it to Kathy, who can feel free to agree or disagree with me, with the underline on agree or disagree. So I think one thing is that we have to compare what has been proposed with what our current code has. And we talk about design standards being a real key here. The proposal has new, real, thoughtful design standards to set a base, right? Our old code has very little of that. So we talk about going from a code that has very little upfront requirements on design standards to one that is more prescriptive. And in fact, we've actually heard from folks in the development community say, hey, there's actually too much for us to sort of handle from a design standard. Now, again, I think there needs to be a balance, which is why we have to have that on the front end. But again, going back to what I said earlier, this is about being proactive in these policies. When we talk about that project in Schumacher Place, that took years to sort of negotiate all those different design things back and forth. The question is, why the hell wouldn't we want to bake these things on the front end? Rather than, again, have the time and expense for everyone, including volunteers in our community, to negotiate those things one by one. So I think actually being proactive and having those design elements built in on the front end is really important. And keep in mind, when we talk about needing a rezoning or needing a variance, there's a reason why there's so many of them, is that we have not comprehensively looked at our maps. So what you can do on this particular parcel in 70 years, right? So you think about how much Columbus has changed, that means that nearly every single project needs to come get a rezoning and a variance because our city has changed so much. Now again, the hope would be that by going through and comprehensively redoing that map, that we've done that engagement on the front end. So again, there's less controversy as these things move through the pipeline. But right now, I understand the concern that folks have to say, we're going to have less of a voice on the way through. My response to them is, well, we're trying to build that in on the front end. And also keep in mind, if you don't need a rezoning, you don't need a variance, you don't need to go to the area commission, you also don't need to come to Columbus City Council. I'm also cutting myself out of this process too.
So the first thing I want to add is that there's many area commissions within the city, and I represent one of those. However, I am familiar with some of the other concerns. And again, the city is a very large place, and what an inner ring neighborhood is experiencing may be very different from what a neighborhood that has been annexed into the city more recently is experiencing, very different. But I think some of the concerns are, I think Rob calls them zoning adjacent, right? So, you know, is the transportation what it needs to be? Is the infrastructure what it needs to be? You know, I have water in my basement now. Is this going to make it worse? Because in the city, at the center of the city, our stormwater and sanitary sewer run together. So it's a very complex problem, and my hope is that when the area commissions can spend less time on the types of variance applications that are routinely approved, like allowing residential on the first floor within a commercial corridor, which has historically been the case, but has to have a variance now, that we can spend that time on the things that happen after the house gets developed or after the property gets developed. And that being said, Rebecca may want to add to this, but I think some of the concerns around the code have, and the character, if you will, have to do with the massing as much or more than any one standard, right? The height and the width and the run, right?
Well, it's that, but I think it's also speed doesn't necessarily mean affordability in the long term, and I think we just want to be careful about that. There's been many times, and actually redlining in some ways arguably came out of the government really looking to private industry, looking to banks, and banks then turning to real estate agency, the National Real Estate Agency, to say how we need to get money out quickly. We are post-World War II. We need to be able to provide loans, and this is coming out of that period, that are not balloon loans. What do you need? And so the risk assessment was, well, we're going to turn to the banks to see how to make things happen, and then the banks turn to the real estate agencies to say, how do we make this happen quickly? And what happened is that we left large swaths of our population behind, and we didn't recognize what they needed. So I think I just always want to caution about when we're moving to a policy landscape where we're taking the brakes out of the system, it's inefficient, right? Anytime we see the number of variances we have, it's always a symptom of bad zoning. Absolutely, we're in agreement there. But I think the real concern is if we're deferring too much to the developers to say what needs to change in our zoning code to speed up the process, we got to be really careful. It's not just massing, it's actually the long-term quality build. We don't want developers to just come in and give us whatever they want. We're a big city now, And actually, one of the things for zone, and I'm hoping to see, is that we actually treat ourselves like a big city. And we say, we have a population, we have demand into our city. How do we put things in place that we can make sure we're doing quality building that can be affordable long-term for everybody? So we've had this in the recent past, and I think we always just have to be careful, because if things don't pencil for the developers to give us that quality build, they're not gonna do it. So how do we put that in place? How do we balance this out now to say, you don't have to file as many variances. We're going to simplify this. We're going to simplify it for commissioners. But what else can we do policy-wise to sort of make sure that those protections are in place?
So I think that that's maybe a perception that this is driven by the development community. We're at the table just like all of the other citizens are at the table, just like all of the other interested parties. So there isn't a slant towards one or the other. That's why this process has been so elongated. Again, if you left it up, I think, to many developers, this could have been a much quicker execution. But what the deliberate community engagement did was get voices from so many across our community. No, it's not going to be everyone, because let's be real, everyone is not interested in zoning. Like, that's just true. And it's okay, but it's not going to be everyone. We're not going to hear from every household. We're not going to hear from every contingent party. But what we did do, and I think the city and in their community engagement efforts, opened the doors. It opened the conversation. If you wanted to plug in, you wanted to be engaged, you could, and it wasn't directed. And I know it feels like that. It's always going to feel like that. That's the push-pull and the uncomfortable part of development, is that, it's the money is driving the activity. Obviously, that's not my day job. We're a nonprofit. We're here to serve. But I know there are other developers that do. They look very closely at the bottom line, and they're not going to pencil a deal that's not going to work. But that's not everyone's story. That's not everyone that's at the table. We were talking about some of the developers in your community, some smaller developers, some emerging developers. There are a lot at the table that want to do the things that are best for this community, and that's what this code does. Again, gives you that baseline to start with. It doesn't remove the engagement process. It doesn't remove the responsibility of any of the development partners to be at the table with the neighbors and with the community, but it does say, okay, I can look at a piece of land and say, I think I can do this, this, and this. Okay, now let me take that design forward and plan for how that would actually work. Versus right now, sometimes it's a complete gray space when I look at a site as to what can I do with that site. What I like to do, what I think would work. I may not be able to get that variance. I may not be able to submit that for funding. And it's a lot of unknowns, which really does, again, back to council member's point, slow down your development process. So that's what the redlining is one piece, but the zoning and what we've seen happen with zoning and that control, that tight control over land use, is that it restricts construction activity by nature. It just does. So meanwhile, we have a team of folks out there selling Columbus, selling Central Ohio, getting us all this business, getting us all this development, and we're restricting construction on the other side with our current policies. So again, it's this calibration that we're trying to do to allow the activity to happen, but with the intentionality that says, this is what we think is best in this part of the town. Okay, now let's talk about what it actually looks like. Base level zoning doesn't tell you what it actually looks like, what it actually feels like, how you engage with it. It just gives you the base level and what you can do with a site, and then you build from there.
So we talked a little bit about neighborhood character, and this will certainly change the character of certain neighborhoods. Right now, we're talking about major corridors like High Street, Broad Street, Cleveland Avenue. I'm just going to throw this out there. How many of you live in Clintonville right now? How many Clintonville residents? How many want taller buildings along High Street? Not bad. Yeah, okay. On High Street, yeah. But what concerns, people will have concerns about neighborhood character and changing the look and the feel of their neighborhood, walkability, all of that. How do you address those types of concerns from people who say, I like my neighborhood how it is. I don't want to change it too much?
Well, I don't want to bum somebody out who has that perspective, but change is coming whether we like it or not. When we're talking about the amount of growth that Columbus is experiencing, there's no neighborhood in Columbus that is not going to be affected by that growth. Things are going to change. The question is, what processes are we going to have in place to put guardrails around that development process? And again, our current code, basically it is in fact broken when you talk about actually having guardrails on the front end versus the back end. I think it's really important when you talk about a city that is growing as much as we're growing. I think if you ask the average person on the street, what is the height limit in most of the city? Maybe they'd say 3 stories or 2 stories or 1 story. It's 35 feet, generally in most of the city of Columbus. That's 2 stories. If you want to build anything more than 2 stories, you have to come get a variance from me for that. So when we talk about, and you can go up and down High Street in Clintonville and see plenty of things that are over 2 stories, either they have been built before zoning, so back before the 1950s, or they came to get a variance from me. And I don't think any of those buildings that are over 2 stories have destroyed that block of High Street. I think it's a question, though, of how do we thoughtfully plan for the future. And again, when we talk about having guardrails in place that helps to channel that growth, having a zoning code that is comprehensively updated, I think is an important tool. It's not the only tool, but it's an important tool in making sure that we're putting guardrails around what does that growth mean for that community. But bottom line, change is coming whether folks like it or not, and it's a question of what do we do about that change as a community.
I think one thing that is a change in the proposal that maybe gets a little less airtime is the allowed uses. So on the south side, we have, and back to your red line point too, we have some bad businesses, and a lot of them are auto-related businesses, either used car lots that almost seem to never sell a car, or they're doing auto repair and taking over the streets, and there's a lot of concerns about some of those businesses. So in the new, at least for those parts of the code that apply to our corridors, a lot of those land uses won't be permitted anymore. That's not to say that the businesses will have to move. They don't have to move. But if they go vacant, there'll have to be something else, right? And so we would be very happy to be more walkable because we're not walking by used car lots that are not adding anything to the neighborhood character.
Obviously we're talking about what's going on here in the city of Columbus. However, there's a housing crunch everywhere, and certainly a number of businesses want their workers to live fairly close to work because it's easier to retain and attract workers. So talk a little bit about suburban zoning and the need to change that. Obviously, some suburbs, Whitehall, Reynoldsburg among them, have changed their codes so to allow more dense housing. Others have not done so. What kinds of discussions have you had, the city had, Leah, you've had, so some suburbs will be more accommodating to not only affordable housing, but just mixed-use development in general, multi-family housing?
So I do want to applaud that many of our communities across Central Ohio are leaning in on this conversation right now. And we have to just acknowledge, until it was a pain point for them, probably weren't going to come to the table to really talk about it, right? And so until you started hearing complaints from the citizens that said, well, my daughter wanted to move back here. She's a teacher and she couldn't buy a house. That's terrible. What can we do about that, right? Like, that's what spurs people to move and to actually take action. And so that has become a common conversation across Central Ohio. And so we do see more of our communities, maybe they haven't actually rehauled their entire zoning plan, but we're having much more effective and productive conversations about where multifamily housing in particular can be. And Kathy, we were talking about this kind of idea, the stigmatization we have around renters. And when we look across our landscape, about 47% of the population in Central Ohio is a rental home, renting housing, and they're okay. They're participating in their community. They're just like us. They're involved and engaged, and there's nothing wrong with having multifamily across the landscape of Central Ohio. And so do see that more, like you specifically called out Whitehall. We've had great partnerships with the city of Whitehall, city of Reynoldsburg, Grove City. We're building our first development in the city of Delaware. Great strides have been made across the communities. Again, not all of them are using rezoning as the tactic. Some of them is more about just changing how they look at development plans and their own land use plans. So that's a separate part of the conversation as it relates to zoning versus land use plans. But just looking at that land use plan to say, we have all these varied uses in our community. Where can multifamily, where can more dense single family sit within that landscape? Where are there redevelopment opportunities and infill? So I do think that, again, this moment is happening now, and this pressure, hate that it had to get to a crisis level. It had to get to a pressure point where housing wasn't there. But now people more and more of our communities are engaged and wanting to be at the table able to say, where can this work in our community? I'd say the other thing that's really, I think, important to keep in mind is that this all works together. And so as we look at communities, they are funded by income taxes. So communities are going to be more inclined to make accommodations for businesses to come in than they are for residences. It just is what it is. So as we think about that, we really have to help people understand the value of the housing stock to support economic development goals, to support the school systems, to support the infrastructure needs of a community, that is a part of the community, not just a residential being a burden to communities, but that also has this really contributing factor that says, like you said, employers want to look at where their employee base is going to come from. They want to look at what the training programs are. They want to look at how people get to and from their business, so that it begins, again, part of the whole instead of being combative uses. Like, we want this instead of that. How do we have both activities going in the same time?
Yeah, what I would add to that is, one, to the suburban communities that have already either started or engaged in this, the ones you mentioned, really, really pleased that they have, that they're aware of the issues that the region, to your point, not just the city of Columbus, are facing. But I also say, look, this is hard, right? When the previous question talking about change, I mean, there's a reason why we haven't done this in decades in Columbus, because it's not easy. If you want to see how engaged people are about this, you should see my inbox right now. Some people are like, yeah, this is great. Many folks don't think so much. And the truth is somewhere in between, right? Where we're trying to be as engaged with residents to collect meaningful feedback that we can incorporate in amendments to this project. But when I look, a number of my colleagues are here today, it takes political will with a legislative body and a mayor to say, we're going to put a stake in the ground. And we know that this is an important issue to deal with our housing crisis. And you have to have the political will to do that. And the easiest thing to do as an elected official is do nothing and tell people everything they want to hear, and you'll probably get reelected over and over again, which is a fine way to go about business. That said, it's also really, really important to tackle the big issues in your community. And I'm just very pleased that I have council colleagues and a mayoral administration that have said, this is important for us to do, and it's important for the future of whether or not teachers, firefighters, police officers, daycare teachers are gonna be allowed to live in the community that they work in. And if we don't do anything, they're not gonna be able to. And that would be my challenge to those suburban communities that have not woken up to the need to engage in meaningful housing reforms, whether or not that's zoning or otherwise, to actually try to make a difference, because you're going to wake up 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, and your community is going to be missing critical pieces, critical people that made the community what it was, and they're not going to be able to afford to call that place home anymore.
I was going to ask Rebecca very quickly. So there's changes coming, and Columbus has a lot of older, very, prominent buildings that people might want to save. How do you think this could affect historically prominent buildings in the community, and what concerns do you have going forward with that?
No, it's a really good question, because I think one of the things we want to make sure we're not asking communities to do is to engage in sort of a false dichotomy, but that's increasingly a reality, though, which is that we're either having affordability or landmark building. And this is kind of where I'm saying, if it doesn't pencil for the developer, they're going to stop doing it. One of the policy changes that happened in 2023 is that you can no longer use low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC credits, with historic tax credits. Now, this is important for a few reasons. One of the most paired tax sort of twinings together was historical tax credits or new market tax credits with LIHTC. Now, this is such that we actually here in Ohio had to change our code to say the Ohio historic tax credits can no longer be with LIHTC because of the federal change. So what we're seeing is kind of the same developers. We had Starling Middle School, wonderful example of a landmark building that became affordable housing. Same developer, couple months later, right? We now have a community losing the East Bakeries building, right? Because it no longer pencils. And so I think this is where we have to really think critically about how can we put and think about the zone and changes so we're creating affordability along with our landmarks. Hey, my family were renters from 1988 until 2007. We had to do that because interest rates kind of looked a little higher than what they are right now. We came up from rural Arkansas, we moved to Columbus for economic mobility. So I'm very supportive of below market rentals, but here's also the other problem. By 2035, some estimates from researchers in Berkeley says that most hedge funds are gonna own almost half of our rental market. So how are we developing spaces that diversify who landlords are? because not every landlord can afford to run a 14-story building, right? The way my family was upwardly mobile was that we relied upon mom and pop landlords, and they're increasingly not available to folks, right? So we need to find creative ways to increase diversity of like, who's renting, what does that look like? You know, nobody can afford a $900 a month studio apartment or now $1,300 a month, right? There's only a small market that can do that. Even if we're setting aside some floors and units to be affordable, again, we need to think about this holistically. I'm really encouraged by the city's connections with our suburbs to make these things happen, but even they have been struggling with losing landmarks and creating affordability for folks, especially to age in place. So the work's not done yet.
So it's CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions. We'll move to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone now. If you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat. But before we take audience questions, I have one more question for the folks on the panel. With these changes coming, what do you think the city's going to look like in 10 years, 20 years? Do you think there really is going to be a lot of change?
I guess I'll start us off. Predicting the future is a fool's errand, but I will, I guess, be a fool here for a second. I think one of the misconceptions that we've heard from folks as they've sort of reacted and tried to digest this proposal is thinking that a zoning change is going to mean a wrecking ball is coming for, the building down the street tomorrow, right? And I think when we talk about from a long-term nature of what do things look like from a development perspective with potential passage of zone in, it's going to take some time, right? And I think the interest rate environment, it really matters when you talk about development. And I'm going to throw it over to Leah here in a second, who's going to have a much better answer than me about this, but at a time when building costs are as high as they have been in a very long time, there's not going to be an immediate tomorrow where you're going to see a flood of changes in all these different areas. What we're trying to do is to set up strategically over the next 10, 20, 30 years, again, what we think that area can support. And also at the same time, I think when we talk about what does the future look like, I think this is also going to be really, really important for the future of the city's capital budget investments. When we talk about a capital budget on an annual basis that's typically over $1 billion, and we have not all the time been as strategic about where those investments need to be to support continued growth. And I think when you have something like Zone In which we are saying these areas in particular, we believe either have the infrastructure today to support that growth, or we're going to make investments to support that growth in the future. I think that's really, really important. So for me, what does it look like? I think Columbus continues to grow. I hope that growth is in a more dense way, a way in which, again, it's more connected to mass transit. CMC, I think, has already had or will have events on Link Us, which is, I think, a critical element towards bringing real, reliable mass transit to Central Ohio and Columbus that's connected to dense housing. That's a mixed ingredient. It's hard to have dense housing and not have good mass transit. It's hard to have good mass transit and not dense housing. So actually seeing all these kinds of things layer on top of one another right now, I think is extremely important when we talk about what is the future of Columbus, right? And we like to joke around City Hall from time to time. Columbus is rarely the first to do anything. We're a very Midwestern city that likes to learn from others and take best practices. And I think Zone In is an example of that, trying to learn from other cities that have engaged in this process. But there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening right now between Zone In, Link Us, cities engaging in its master art plan, bike plan. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are coming to fruition right now, the next year or 2 years, that are going to shape what Central Ohio, Columbus looks like into the future. So I'm going to stop predicting the future and hand it over to Leah, who's going to give you a much better answer than me.
No, I would just add, Councilmember, I think you really summarized it well. Paraphrasing a quote, failure to plan is a plan to fail. And so I think without clear plans for our community, we're not going to see the community we want to see. So I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think through Zone In, we are saying what we want it to look like. So versus what kind of happens to us, this Zone In initiative and Link Us and all of our community-based initiatives are talking about the community we want it to be. And this is our opportunity to write that. So we're writing that now. If I started a development plan today, if some building you won't see for 3, maybe 4 years. So what we're talking about today is what will look like in 10 years. We're setting that up right now. So I think that's why it's important that we're at the table. We're all not going to agree. That's not what we're here to do, is not to get mass agreement. movement, but it is for us to all participate in what it is the community that we want to see. I agree. I want it to continue to be growing. I want it to be dense in the appropriate places, right? I want transit. We want to see green spaces. We want to increase our tree canopy. We want to do all these things and be the trendsetter in terms of how a Midwestern city can continue to grow and have the best quality of life available to all of its citizens. So I think that's the community we're aspiring to, and that's what we're doing now.
And I'm going to jump in right now because we have a bunch of people waiting to ask questions. So, Sophia, what's our first question, either online or in person?
Thank you so much for mentioning all of the initiatives that are happening here in our city. For those who are curious to learn more, we have discussed our public art plan. We've also discussed Linked Us. You can find those recordings on our podcast and on YouTube, so please check it out. For those who are in the room, obviously we have a lot of questions today. So panelists, if you can keep your responses as short and condensed as possible. We also have quite a few online questions, and I will get to it right now. And just a reminder, when you ask a question here at the CMC, you ask it within 30 seconds, and it always ends with a question mark. Exactly, a question mark. Thank you so much. Jill Levy asks, why do the big multi-level buildings get large tax abatements in the city if the city is looking to have more revenue?
So last year, the city changed its community reinvestment policy, so CRA, which many folks colloquially refer to as sort of tax abatement policy, to be citywide. And one of the reasons for that was the way it was originally constructed was any CRA was piecemeal. Generally, they were requested by a developer within a certain area for a specific project. And it was not equitable across Columbus, really to encourage to bring more housing out of the ground. So one of the changes was to move towards a citywide plan, but also to update that policy to require affordable housing requirements within it. So if you want a tax incentive from the city, you need to provide affordable housing units within that development. And that is something when we talk about different tools, when we talk about housing, is an important one. It's not the only one. But also, when we talk about how this policy is viewed generally, I think it would probably surprise many folks in this room to learn that currently, right now in the city of Columbus, there are 2% of our parcels have a tax incentive on them. Yet this is a huge driver of a lot of our conversation around housing and development, and I get it. I get why we do that, and every single year this policy has come up for review by Columbus City Council. I've been very proud to work with my colleagues to enhance that policy, to demand more from the housing providing community, to go deeper from an affordability standpoint and provide more units. But that's just one piece to a very, very large puzzle as it relates to how do we produce more housing in Columbus.
My name is Brian Urbanski with the Aubrey Affordable Housing Foundation, and we've heard a lot of talk today about affordable housing. It seems like we have to have that conversation every time zoning and other things come up. And great to see you again, Becca. It was great presenting for you last year. Hey, my concern probably to you, Rob, is are there any proposed code revisions that are going to make it easier to restore or remove long-term blighted properties in traditionally affordable housing neighborhoods?
So we're looking at a number of amendments that we will have a public hearing in a couple weeks at council to review. I think when we talk about how do we provide protection for historical buildings, structures, et cetera, one, there is going to be an amendment that clarifies sort of the interaction between our historical commissions and the zoning code to make clear that that the historical commission's requirements and rules for certificates of appropriateness maintain, that zoning does not trump that, which I think is a really important clarification for folks to have. And again, I think when we talk about expanding additional protections, keep in mind, the zoning code does not provide protections for anything right now. The code itself does not provide those. What it does do is essentially, because you have a requirement that folks need to come get a rezoning or a variance, typically it's used sort of as a proxy for preservation. And while that may be well and good for preserving history in Columbus, I think we should probably think about a better, more proactive policy around how we accomplish those protections versus just using a zoning code to do so, which is not intended to. And it's not intended for that to happen. So that's where something that I know I'm particularly interested in working on in the future, but this is sort of one of those zoning adjacent items that, if nothing else, I think council's heard a lot of issues that folks have concerns around developing Columbus, and they're not necessarily maybe zoning. And I think that's going to be one of the next big things that council picks up post-zone in, is addressing some of those things that folks have articulated throughout this process.
My name is Sam Zimmerman, and my question is for Mr. Dorans. My family owns 20 acres of undeveloped land at the property at the corner of Henderson and Olentangy, and it has been identified by the city with high development potential for multifamily under the Northwest Area Plan and the Link Us Plan. It's in fact on a Link Us corridor. We've previously spoken with you and other council members and other representatives of the city regarding our keen interest in building new housing, helping to solve this housing crisis, at least 400 apartments. In your most recent zone and public meeting on June 27th, the city expressed support for adding additional properties, including our property to the Phase 1 MAP initiative, but only after an additional notice and public comment period. So here's my question. My question is, given the severity of our housing crisis, why has the city not already initiated this process to have these additional properties like ours, 161 Campus Partners, which is Ohio State University, added to the Phase 1 MAP as soon as possible? Can you tell us when this process will be initiated? Finally, do you, Mr. Dorans, personally support having our 20-acre site included with the properties that will be added to the Phase 1 MAP? Thank you.
Well, I think the old adage of how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And I'm trying to get to a point where we're talking about a Phase 1 proposal that is, again, 6% of the city. That is important for us to be very comprehensive in how we're trying to approach these issues. But when you talk about the level of public engagement that is taken to get us to a vote potentially in July, 78,000 postcards, thousands of visits to a zoning gallery, thousands of emails, thousands of, I mean, there's a number of folks from our planning office here that I think moved into the zoning gallery. So thank you all for doing that for all that time where residents were able to come down. So I don't think to take community engagement on this process should not be taken lightly, and I think it's very important for us to get this first phase done, especially while we're considering amendments that have been generated based upon the public comment period that we've had. And I think it's going to be very important to incorporate those things into the base code before we move to anything further. And I think getting to the place where we have the right policies in place is going to be first and foremost before we start initiating any additional public comment period to bring more properties in future phases. That said, generally, we're talking about 6% of the city here in the first phase. The rest of the city, we have certainly our plans are to move towards future phases in which, again, we will likely bring different zoning districts than what have been proposed here. And that's because 80% of the city right now is zoned single family. The vast majority of these parcels are zoned commercial. So it's really important when we think about what zoning districts make the most sense. We've got capacity issues. We got a lot of smart people that work for the city. We got a lot of smart people we've hired to work with us on this initiative. But we're trying to eat this elephant one bite at a time.
Mindy Justice asks, can you speak to the volume of neighbors needed to successfully get the amenities we all want? So many homes, how many homes do we need to get the grocery stores and small businesses that help communities thrive?
All I can say is when the Giant Eagle closed on Whittier, that was a major concern, that they were losing a grocery store that people like to walk to. But Michael Wilkos, who many of you know with United Way, has a lot of data on how many heads used to live in these same buildings that live there now, and it's about half in some of these neighborhoods, the same. So what we need to get, I don't know, I'm not a retail consultant, but what I do know is we need to get a lot more than what we have now because we can't sustain some of these businesses without more bodies.
And I'll add quickly that the numbers and demographics for retail has changed significantly as how people shop has changed. So I think, as that data continues to evolve, it is continually for developers, particularly in our commercial space, that they're looking at that real-time data, really addressing what those kind of retail users want to see. It's not a straightforward, straight line computation. I know in Linden, they just recently did a retail market study in conjunction with the One Linden plan. So there's a lot of information and data the team is looking at, but it is still driven by that market and that consumer. Where do you shop? Where do you get your coffee from? Where do you go to get your groceries? And how that all impacts those community amenities that generally people want to see. But it does get back to that density, as Kathy was saying.
Nancy Ritchie, historic preservation consultant. My question has to do with community character and the impact that this zoning change will have, particularly in the short north. I'm old enough to remember those neighborhoods and how long it took them to become the successful neighborhoods they are. The zoning at 16 stories maximum automatically will be 300 to 500% increase in the character of that district. Right now, there are 2 5-story historic buildings. 2, that's the maximum. It's going from 12 to 16 stories. Mr. Dorans, you said that there are going to be guidelines and protections that go with this zoning. Specifically, can you address what will prevent developers from tearing down every single 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-story building in that district over the next 20 years?
Well, there is no specific protection. There is no specific protection in the current zoning code either, other than needing a rezoning or a variance. When we talk about the question of increasing height, so the highest base district that we have is 12 stories. You can move that up to 16 through increasing your affordable housing commitment. But when we talk about these 6 different zoning districts, they're customized to the areas in which they've been applied to. So you're not seeing that 12-story zoning district with a potential additional 4-story bonus in the middle of a neighborhood, right? They're at areas where there's already a lot of density, where there's density that currently exists that we think the public infrastructure can support more. And at the end of the day, when we talk about protections for individual buildings or businesses, I think that's a good conversation for the city to engage in. But currently, protections of buildings simply through a zoning code is not the most appropriate way to address that, in my opinion.
We've had an incredible number of questions today. I just want to ask one quick question. If folks have more questions, comments, or concerns or thoughts, where can they go to express those thoughts?
Sure. So if you want to go to columbus.gov/zoning update, you can submit, probably at this point the best is comments through the zoning email address that's on there. You're also welcome to just fill up my inbox. You'll rarely hear a elected official give you their email, but here it goes. It's radorns@columbus.gov. It's on the city council website as well. If you don't get a response from me immediately from you, we will try to get to you as soon as possible. But it has been, our attempt to make sure that when folks have questions, whether they like the answers or not, that we're giving them the answers. And I think when we talk about the last several months of public engagement, the last 2 years of public engagement that's led us to this, we've engaged with thousands of people across Columbus. There's not a perfect answer for every one of these questions or concerns that come up. And I would say one of the key things that the zoning committee and city council will do in the future, hopefully we have fewer rezonings and variances because we have an updated code. But one of the things I would want that committee to start to use its time on is addressing some of these larger holistic questions that folks have about how do you go about providing protection for historical properties? How do you go about providing more protections for green space and other things within our community? These are worthy questions. They may not exactly be zoning questions, but they're worthy questions that your city should engage with relevant stakeholders who have expertise in those areas to bring real, proactive public policy while we're growing. And I think that's one of the really important things for us to get ahead of this growth as much as we can.
Thank you, everybody, for a great discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you. I just want to say this is just the kind of conversation that the Columbus Metropolitan Club really aims to present to the community. Topic that people care about, land use plan. We're sold out, lots of people online, lots of questions, and folks collaborating to get to the best answer for the city in responding to the growth in our market and changing dynamics of our market. So I want to just say a couple things of thanks to Rob, Leah, Rebecca, Kathy, and Mark for being here today to talk through these issues. And it's not new to you. You've been at it for a long time, so we appreciate you being here today. I want to thank the Crane Group again for sponsoring, the Ellis for having us, the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation, and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. And just really, we hope to have you back. Please make plans. You better act fast because I'm sure this one will reach capacity as well. And that is Ted Carter, Dr. Ted Carter, who is president of The Ohio State University, and he is our featured speaker at our next forum, which will be at the View, which is a larger venue where we host luncheons. So we're looking forward to that. I think that's probably before Matt goes to the Olympics. I think he's off soon. to go cover the Olympics. So we appreciate you all being here, engaging in this topic. Very much appreciate all of you panelists. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.